Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. This is our guest lecture with Barbara Haya. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Barbara Haya. Barbara is a research fellow at the Center for Environmental Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Barbara's work combines research and outreach with a focus on the effectiveness of carbon offset programs. She directs the Berkeley Carbon Trading Project, which examines the outcomes of California's voluntary offset programs and performs outreach to ensure the project's research results inform offset program design. Barbara is also helping the University of California system develop its strategy for procuring carbon offsets for use towards meeting the university's carbon reduction and neutrality goals. Really delighted to have you here with us today, Barbara. Over to you.
Okay, great. Excited to be here. Okay, let me share screen. Here we go. Good. And yeah, and as I'm talking, I'm very happy to take questions, especially clarifying questions. Offsets can be pretty complicated, so I want to make sure I'm bringing everyone along. So I'm Barbara Haya, and I've been studying carbon offset quality for over 20 years now, and seeing major quality challenges through several generations of offset programs. So what I want to do for the next half hour or so is really take you on my journey. Describing what offsets are, basically how they work, and then what I saw across the years of studying these different offset programs in terms of the quality challenges, and then coming to where we are today, where the market is changing really quickly. It seems like every day or two, a new major company is taking on a carbon neutrality goal. Many companies, as well as universities and cities with carbon neutrality goals, are meeting their targets largely through reducing their own emissions, but also using offsets a lot. And there's also the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out I think 2 weeks ago with a major report, basically a call to action. We have a limited period of time. We need to be reducing global emissions to, they estimate, 43%. By 2030, and then to net neutrality by mid-century in order to keep us likely below 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's growing recognition of the quality challenges with offsets, and that we really need to fix this market quickly so that all of these funds being invested in climate mitigation through offsets actually does support climate mitigation rather than undermining our efforts. And that we need to fix this quickly before we lose the momentum when we still have a chance to prevent the worst impacts from climate change. So I'll describe the current discussions and then what companies and others can do today, given sort of the pool of projects we have available today. So here we go. So the first major offset program was the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism. So under the Kyoto Protocol, and forgive me, I'm probably telling you things you already know, but under the Kyoto Protocol, which was the second major global climate agreement, industrialized countries had caps, developing countries didn't have caps on their emissions, recognizing that industrialized countries are largely responsible for causing climate change and also have greater financial capacity to pay for mitigation. And then industrialized countries argued that, since greenhouse gases are well mixed in the atmosphere, it doesn't matter where emissions reductions happen anywhere in the world. So if it's cheaper to support projects somewhere else, like in developing countries that don't have caps, why shouldn't they be allowed to pay for emissions reductions there and use those reductions towards their own domestic targets? And thus we have the first major carbon offset program, the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism. And from those early years until today, here's the breakdown of the types of projects. So basically the way offsets work is the regulatory agency or whoever's running the program, in this case, the UN, defines a set of project types that are allowed to participate. They then define the rules for how to estimate emissions reductions from the projects. Anyone who wants to implement a project, like a wind power developer, will make sure that they're following the rules of the protocol. They'll estimate the emissions reductions in a way that's defined by the protocol. They'll hire a third-party verifier to make sure that their estimates are accurate and following the rules of the protocol. Submit that to the UN reviews it. If everything's fine, they generate credits. Each credit should equal 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent reduced or removed from the atmosphere. And then once those credits are generated, that wind power utility can then sell those credits to a buyer. And that buyer could be someone who's regulated under carbon cap, like the UN program, or it could be a voluntary entity, a company that's taken on a carbon neutrality goal. So I started off, I guess 20 years ago, looking at the early years of the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism, doing initial pre-dissertation research in India, looking at biomass power, trying to understand, how effective the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism is. And in these early interviews, I heard some things that sounded really strange to me, where I was interviewing sugar factory owners in southern India that were participating in the UN's program. And the early conversations went something like this. I'd ask them, tell me about the story, like why you decided to implement this biomass cogeneration project. And they would say, well, we had subsidies from the Indian government, both federal and state, and it just made sense for, we're a large sugar factory, and it just made financial sense. Now we're not only producing sugar, we're also producing electricity. It made, it's good for the business. And then I would ask them, but in order to participate in the UN's offset program, you need to demonstrate that you would not have built the project were it not for the offset income, right? Industrialized countries should only be able to use these credits if their funds cause the emissions reductions to happen. If they're just paying for what would have happened anyway, they're not really reducing emissions. They can't use that sugar, the biomass cogeneration facility towards their own domestic targets. And then they would tell me the arguments that they used, what they put in their application to the UN to show that they wouldn't have built their project without offsets. And it was, and what I saw is that over time, doing these interviews, these power producers didn't see themselves as doing anything wrong. They didn't see themselves as gaming the system. They saw themselves as being rewarded for projects that had global benefit. And they were just filling out this paperwork that didn't make any sense. And what I found in my dissertation was that they were right. The paperwork did not make any sense. So the UN requires each facility to show that to prove that they wouldn't have built the project were it not for the offset income. And they could do that through actually a three-part additionality test, where these two are options, or you choose one of those. So you have to prove that you are not required by law, and then you do either a barriers test or a financial test, where the barriers test is you can argue that there were barriers that prevented your project from going forward. And what I saw is that really it's very easy to pass the barriers test because all projects have barriers, and that the third-party verifiers weren't really being discriminating. It was very easy to tell a story. Because of how squishy the barriers test is, many project developers were choosing the financial test because it was seen as a lot more rigorous. And with a financial test, what you could do is show that your project is not cost effective without carbon offset income. And what I spent a lot of my PhD dissertation showing is that it's really, these are financial assessments where for a future project where there are a lot of assumptions that go into projecting what the financial returns are going to be on a project. And it was really easy for project developers to strategically choose assumptions in their financial assessment that shows that a cost-effective project is not cost-effective. And for example, I spoke with one consultant who worked on wind power facilities in India, who said that he would develop two different financial projections for a single project. One he would send to the bank in their application for a loan that showed that the project was cost effective even without offsets. And then another he would send to the UN Clean Development Mechanism showing that the project is not cost effective without offsets. And then the last test is you have to prove that your project is not common practice in the region. And this test also didn't work. For example, in China, the world's largest hydropower facility, a country developing the most hydropower with the most hydropower capacity, over 1,000 hydropower projects managed to somehow prove that they were not common practice in China. So shifting to the second generation offset program, California, where I am and been watching the program really carefully, we have a cap and trade program where we require all of our 650 major emitters in the state to reduce emissions. And we allow those emitters to also use offsets to meet those targets. So instead of reducing their own emissions, they can invest in these offsets. And California has designed its offset program, recognizing the problems with the Kyoto Protocol's offset program. Instead of requiring each project developer to prove that their project is additional, they define project types that are not likely to be additional and just allow any project of that type to participate. So California has defined 6 project types that are allowed to produce credits. And 2 of them have not produced any credits so far. Most of the credits are from forests. So this is improved forest management. The other project types are the capture of ozone depleting substances, which are also major greenhouse gases, to capture them from discarded refrigerators and air conditioners and foam. The capture of methane that would otherwise be released to the atmosphere in the process of coal mining, and the implementation of manure methane digesters at livestock facilities, basically collecting manure that would otherwise be degraded in pools and capturing it in a digester that can be used to generate electricity or steam. All of these projects can be anywhere in the US, not just in California. So I think this program is developed in a much better way. Project by project testing doesn't work very well, but the devil's in the details, or in really how you define what's allowed in the emissions reduction calculations. And I've seen a lot of problems with this sort of more standardized approach. So let me run through those with you. So additionality, here's the issue with a standardized approach to additionality. So where you allow in any livestock digester. So, for before California, the California Air Resources Board adopted its protocol in 2012, here's how many of these systems were put into place. So there was some development, much less than the potential in the US, but there was still some development. And what you would do if you're a policy analyst trying to understand, well, how effective is California's livestock protocol? You would do some sort of a trend analysis where you would say, well, what's the business as usual? What would likely have happened without the program? And then you'd only generate credits for the amount above that. You would generate some sort of trend line. There's a problem that there's a lot of uncertainty in what that trend line would be, but you choose one and you'd only credit what happens above that, right? What's truly additional. But that's not the way the program works. That's not the way California's program works. That's also not the way the voluntary market works. That is, once you develop the protocol, if you use the standardized approach, any new project is allowed to participate. You basically are saying that, we're responsible. This new incentive program is responsible for all new development from the time that it's adopted. And what we really need to do is to do that net to gross analysis and figure out, well, what's additional and what's not, and only credit the true impact of the program. A challenge is that there's a lot of uncertainty in what that trend line is. So that's a key challenge of offsets when you're measuring emissions reductions against a counterfactual scenario. What would have happened? So that issue of what would have happened also affects baseline. So the protocol with the most credits is the forest offset protocol. And there are a slew of quality challenges with this program. And let me just run through really the first two. So, one question with additionality is, would the activity have happened anyway? You have a similar question of, well, if there is a change in practice, what would have happened anyway? What is the baseline? So the way that California's forest offset protocol works is, any landowner is allowed to participate if they manage their land in a way that holds more carbon than the baseline, than what they would have done anyway. How is the baseline? The key challenge is, well, how is the baseline determined? And for the most part, the baseline is defined as the average for that forest type. So, basically the way the protocol works is you run a model, the blue line, that predicts what you would have done were it not for the offset income. You take the average of that scenario, and that's the baseline. Like I said, most of the baselines are set at the average for the forest type. In the first year, you get paid the difference between your initial carbon stocks that are actually on the land, the difference between that and the baseline. And then every subsequent year, you get paid for the incremental growth on the land. You need to commit to holding that carbon for 100 years. And I think that it's that commitment that's the real impact of the program. Baselines are problematic in that if you define your baseline by the average for the forest type, one thing we know about averages is by definition, half of forest carbon is on land that holds more than average carbon and half is on land that holds less than average carbon. So that any landowner that is already, for whatever reason, holding more than average carbon and would have into the future can now get paid for what they would have done anyway. And we're seeing that most participating landowners are landowners that already have been managing their land for many, many years to hold more than average carbon, because they often start off with, here's an actual project, and this is not uncommon, that initial carbon stocks are well above the baseline. So we see lots of overcrediting because of the way the baseline is set. A second challenge is this, that let's say for any specific project, let's say the baseline is true. Let's say this landowner would have aggressively harvested their lands and degraded the carbon stocks over the first 10 years of the project. If they do that, and they do that through reducing the amount that they're or they do that through harvesting. So what most projects are they say that they're reducing the amount of harvesting compared to the baseline. When you reduce harvesting, but you don't change the demand for timber products, that timber is just going to come from somewhere else. So you're not really reducing all of those emissions. You're reducing some of them, and you're causing some of them to be displaced to somewhere else, to some other forest that's going to be harvested more to meet demand. And that's called leakage. So I released an article on looking at California's method for estimating leakage. And here's let me run you through what we found. And that is, so the first line is the difference between initial carbon stocks and the baseline. That's this A. And that's, they're basically credited this minus leakage minus an uncertainty deduction. So this is what that landowner was credited in the first year of the project. This is the very small leakage deduction that was taken to generate these credits. And here's what's happening. So the California Air Resources Board, California defines a leakage rate of 20%. The literature points to something more like 80 or 90%. So if a 90% leakage rate was applied to that first year of reductions, here's what the deduction would be. You would take out this amount because of leakage, and you would only get paid or earn credits equal to a small amount, basically this line, or let's say this line minus this line. If we chose a 50% leakage rate, this is how much would be deducted, how many credits would be deducted from this line. California uses a 20% leakage rate, not reflected in the literature. And so this is the amount that would be deducted in the first year, except that they take that amount and they average it over 100 years. So this is what's deducted, which is basically this number divided by 100. So the point here is just, there's a lot of uncertainty in what the true leakage rate is. We need more research on this. But ARB, or California, has chosen a very lenient method for estimating leakage, which is causing a large amount of overcrediting. And I see a question from Remy.
Looks like we have a clarifying question.
Yeah.
Hi, Barbara.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just had a question. Is this leakage rate the same regardless of whether it's a reforestation, afforestation, or forest conservation project, or does it differ based on what kind of project it is?
It differs based on what kind of project. So most of the forest offset projects in the US are improved forest management. So it's the 20% leakage rate. The leakage issues for the other project types are different. So when you're planting trees, like a reforestation project, the leakage is caused from displacing whatever was there before. So if you were switching cropland into forest land, where does that cropland or the whatever was produced on that land, where is it produced instead? And what are the carbon impacts of that? I don't remember what leakage rate is used or how leakage is estimated for reforestation. And then for avoided conversion or avoided deforestation, it's a different question. And there it's, so if you're avoiding deforestation, what is causing that deforestation? And are you just displacing deforestation to somewhere else? Like to clear land for ranching, for example, and internationally. Any other clarifying questions?
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay. So for California's Forest Offset Protocol, there are two other issues. One is durability. And really quickly, whenever you're generating credits from storing carbon rather than from reducing emissions, you have a durability issue. And that is, there's a risk that the carbon that you're storing will be released back into the atmosphere, such as through wildfire. And if it is, then then you've undone a lot of the benefit of the project. You really need to store it long term in order for it to really be equivalent with reducing CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. And then the other is a perverse incentive issue that is an issue for offsets in general. And I want to introduce it here. So the idea there is that when you have a program that only looks at carbon for project types that affect many other things or have many other co-benefits or risks, you can cause perverse incentives. For example, with this forest offset protocol in California, in the Western US, there's an issue of, many of our forests are in crisis because of fire suppression for many years. So that fire suppression is now causing the conditions where wildfire is getting more and more severe. And that combined with the effects of climate change is causing sort of this crisis where we're seeing a huge increase in the number of wildfires and the severity of wildfires. So the California government, as well as throughout the Western US, is focusing on thinning forests in order to create healthier forests that are more resilient to the impacts of climate change and to wildfire. The problem is that California's Forest Offset Protocol is creating a very immediate near-term financial incentive to increase stocks and not to thin. And not to do sort of to decrease the carbon stocks that's needed long-term to reduce the risk of wildfire and disease. So there, I just want to make the point, we see that with other project types as well, is that when you're only looking at carbon, it can cause inadvertent negative impacts in other ways. And there are other perverse incentives with coal mine methane capture. Just really quickly, you're creating with, coal mining is the most greenhouse gas intensive of activities. And the California's coal mine methane protocol is creating an incentive to coal mines to capture methane that would have otherwise been released to the atmosphere in the process of coal mining. The challenge is that offsets work through creating a new profit source for businesses and to make businesses decide to implement these projects. But in this case, you're creating a new profit source for coal mining. So the question is, or what we've seen is that for the gaseous mines, again, I've looked at the US and California's program, for the gaseous mines in the country, we're creating a new profit source that the profits from offsets can be enough for the gaseous mines to help out a coal mine that might be struggling to stay open. So we need to really watch carefully to make sure that as prices go up, that we aren't inadvertently keeping coal mines open longer than they would have. And another challenge just in general is whenever you create a financial incentive through an offset program, because once a project type is required by law, it can no longer generate credits, right? It's non-additional, it's required by law. The concern is that an offset program could create a disincentive for governments to regulate. And without going into the details, we've seen evidence that this might be happening with California. This might have happened with California's coal mine methane protocol as the federal government was deciding whether and how to regulate coal mine methane emissions from federally owned lands. And that's just to say this is an issue, a broad issue or a real concern with offsets also internationally, that once you create that revenue source, does it disincentivize governments from regulating? Because then companies will no longer be able to get those credits and that income through selling offsets. So for the quality issues that we've seen are non-additionality, baselines, leakage accounting, potential for perverse incentives. There are also protocols that otherwise choose methods for estimating emissions reductions in a way that overestimates, like we've seen with the leakage accounting, durability risk, and then, do no harm, making sure you aren't otherwise causing harm related to perverse incentives. And basically what I've seen is, we have the Kyoto Protocols program where, I forget if I said this, in the end, I found that the large majority of Kyoto Protocol offset projects most likely are non-additional. Another study that came after mine that did a more comprehensive review of many project types estimates that 85% of Kyoto Protocol offset projects are most likely non-additional, and only 2% have a high likelihood of not overcrediting. And then California's offset program, the leakage and baselines analyses, it looks like, again, the large majority of credits are overcredited. Even though the programs are having some impact, they're overcrediting that impact by a lot. And then when you look at the voluntary market, we're also continue to see large amounts of overcrediting. And if we share the slides, or also there's a link to this database, so you can see what the projects are, but globally, so this is on the global voluntary market, that companies that have carbon neutrality targets, these are the main sets of credits that they can choose from. And most are forests or renewable energy. You also have landfill methane. Here's mine methane capture under industrial manufacturing, and a range of other projects, including cook stoves and biodigesters in the global south. So we see quality challenges really across the board, where the registries that are designing the protocols are not taking additionality seriously, and otherwise are choosing methods for estimating emissions reductions that exaggerate emissions. Emissions reductions. A few more slides. I want to talk about why we're seeing such poor quality and what companies can do today. So, why are we seeing such poor quality after 20 years of learning by doing? And I think offsets are sort of a perfect storm for poor quality, and here's why. So for one, there are high levels of uncertainty, right? It's really hard to know what would have happened otherwise, what projects are additional, what the baseline is. You have to measure emissions reductions against a counterfactual scenario that never happened. There's also a lot of uncertainty in leakage and other elements of estimating emissions reductions. And that high levels of uncertainty are being deliberated by a set of decision makers that all have a conflict of interest, that all benefit from a larger and therefore poor quality market, where the buyers, want cheap carbon credits, the sellers want to sell more credits, the third-party verifiers want to be hired again, and the registries that are designing the rules and writing the protocols also benefit from a larger market, and they each want market share. And I think that's also being met by sort of who's writing the rules. Many of the people who are involved in developing protocols come from a developer's perspective. A lot of the protocols are written by project developers themselves that sort of propose a new protocol to the registries. And they come from this perspective. A lot of the actors come from the perspective of, we're seeing forests being cut down, and we're seeing methane being spewed from coal mines, and we need new sources of funding to pay for these projects. And they're looking at this from the perspective of, we need to be, we haven't seen money coming in, not nearly sufficient funding coming from the federal government, from the UN program, and offsets through private actors could be a large source of funding for these really needed projects. And where they're really looking at, how do we create an effective incentive program, rather than how do we make sure that the credits are not over-credited, and so they aren't being used by a buyer to justify continued emissions, or to trade with direct emissions reductions in the buyer's facilities. And I think what we're seeing is that we're stuck in a poor quality loop where we have such poor quality on the market. So if any of the registries were to design an improved forest management protocol that works a lot better, who would participate in it? Because you'd get 1/5 of the credits. We really need some sort of a real change in the market to go from this poor quality system to higher quality system. And so we're seeing this upheaval right now, or this sort of a lot of change happening right now in the industry, as we're seeing a lot more demand as companies are taking on these targets and coming closer to needing to meet them. There's this surge in demand for credits. And there's also a lot more understanding of the quality challenges, and this idea that, wait, we need to fix the quality challenges quickly before the whole system collapses. And I see, I guess, basically 3 different ways forward, or 3 different things happening in these discussions of how do we go forward. So there's a real emphasis on science-based targets, where so there's a science-based target initiative, and a lot of people are really pointing to the ideas in this initiative, where we need companies and cities and everyone really to focus primarily on directly reducing our own emissions in line with our fair share of global effort. We have to do that first, and then everything else is in addition to that, where we need to publicize direct emissions reductions and these offsets, or otherwise these beyond value chain mitigation, separately, where we can't just call ourselves net carbon neutral, where we have to say how much we're emitting and how much we're compensating with off campus or out of supply chain mitigation. There's also recognition that we have to shift over time from beyond value chain mitigation focused on supporting reductions to permanent removals. And that's been supported also by this new IPCC report that points to, we're beyond, we can't just reduce our own emissions, we also have to be drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. And that drawing carbon out of the atmosphere with natural, with forests and soils, we need to be doing that, but there's always a risk of reversal. So we need to be developing these engineered solutions with real permanent removal. So And in addition to that, there are sort of two other approaches. And given that we will continue, companies are still going to be putting money into climate change mitigation outside of their supply chains, you can either do that through offsetting, so in which case we need to fix the quality challenges, or we need to do that through shifting away from the offset approach and offset mentality towards a more contributions approach. And that is away from a ton for ton approach and more to we're putting money into climate change mitigation. And let me just say, I think shifting away from offsets is more accurate to what offsets are. And that is, it's really hard to know what would have happened without offsets. What the baseline is, how much is additional, how much isn't additional. And what offsets really are is an incentive program. We call them, quantify tons of emissions reductions, but I don't believe they are that. For the most part, offsets are a way for companies to support an incentive program that reduces some hard to estimate quantity of emissions reductions, like this US livestock protocol, right? We're putting money into supporting manure methane digesters. It's really hard to know what would have happened otherwise, but that money, it should be increasing the number of these projects that go forward. So if we sort of embrace what offsets really are, which is a way of paying into an incentive program, we're moving away from that ton for ton approach into a more contributions approach. This reflects what offsets truly are. It can be more effective where you can put money into moonshot ideas and pilot projects and a wider set of projects that might be hard to quantify but can have greater benefit. You're not limited to the offset registries. And it doesn't trade with emissions reductions. So you don't have, it's an additional to your own emissions reductions rather than trading a ton for a ton. But some days I wake up and I say, well, we need to really fix the offset market so it can be trusted, because companies those carbon neutrality targets are really driving a lot of money. And would companies choose a contributions approach if they couldn't call themselves carbon neutral? There's also the advantage here is you're verified against a standard, whereas who's going to look at your contributions and say what's a legitimate contribution and what isn't, right? So it can be more effective, but then it can also be more gameable. But and there's a lot of effort going on to really push the registries to tighten up their standards. But the question is, if it hasn't been done for 20 years, why do we think we can do it now? But that's just to say there's a lot of work being done in all of these areas right now, and we don't know what direction offsets are going to go. So just really quickly, what does this mean for buyers today? And what are our choices? And I'm helping the University of California figure out our strategy for procuring offsets. And that's just to say we're pushing for the system to focus more on our direct emissions reductions, to not call ourselves net carbon neutral, but to publicize both our emissions and what we're doing off campus. And then another thing that we're doing is we are buying offsets, but we do recognize the quality challenges. And one thing we're doing is we're developing our own projects where we put out a request for ideas from faculty, students, and staff for ideas for how we can take university research and put that into implemented large-scale offset projects. And we've supported 12 pilot projects. I could send you the link. Another approach is to develop a relationship with a trusted partner and help expand their work, where you're really doing deep due diligence in specific entity, and you know that you're having a difference if your commitment to procure those credits really helps them expand their work or do more projects, or otherwise you can do very careful due diligence of the quality of the offsets that you buy, which can be challenging because it's very hard to know what's additional and what isn't, and these protocols are very technical. But it's worth doing. It's necessary to do if you're buying off of the offset market. Another approach is to shift away from offset sort of contributions approach and really focusing on your supply chain, focusing maybe on local efforts where your businesses are, where you're supplying, where you're getting your supply chain and materials. Again, supporting good organizations, but maybe not with a ton for ton approach, and other possibilities, supporting pilot projects, supporting local NGOs, nonprofits. And then I just want to end. I don't think we talk enough about we're in a climate emergency, and just it's good to be reminded of, I see how decisions are made even at the University of California, and we're sort of plodding along like with our planning and, buying all these offsets and, budgetary requirements and limitations, and wait a minute, we're in a climate emergency, and it's just good to be reminded, we should go into lockdown tomorrow. The cost of doing offsets right is small compared to the risk of not. And yeah, here's my contact information, and our offset database, as well as our research. So I welcome any questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Barbara. We've got lots of great questions here. I think folks really from early in the presentation gathered the extent of these challenges and started to ask questions like, is it possible to solve these problems? Which it seems like you addressed pretty well in your last couple of slides, outlining some of the approaches with both improving quality and then moving toward a contributions approach. But I guess then I would just ask you to reiterate where you stand, specifically for California and the work that you've done, where you think things are or should be heading in terms of whether the improving quality or going to a different approach is a better approach.
Yeah, and it's a really good question. And some days I wake up and I say, like, we just need to fix the offset market because companies really need those verified tons. But I see real challenges in doing that. And I think we need, anyway, that's just to say, I don't know, but I think both approaches are really very valid, and we need to be moving in both approaches. I think if you're working with a company or university that's buying offsets, the one thing I know is you have to be really careful. What we need are buyers that demand quality and don't buy poor quality credits. And I think once companies really put the stake in the ground and say, we're only buying quality credits, the market has to, that's the power that companies and buyers have. So I would say, if you're going to buy offsets, do these things. Work with a trusted partner if you can. I also think that if you're able to, I think that moving to a contributions approach is also a very valid direction. I think it's a direction that a lot of companies and others are going in. Yeah, and I would say just think about what you can do from where you stand to have the most climate impact.
Great answer. It seems like some folks were curious specifically about how credits for forest management work. What happens to carbon credits if the forests get lost due to wildfire? Is there insurance on them? And just some insight into, somebody was asking, not exactly your realm of expertise, but about what forest management looks like, the thinning, clearing forest floors, that sort of stuff, and interest around the wildfire case.
Great. Yeah. So on the wildfire, there is an insurance program. So what each of the registries does is they estimate what the risk is of reversal from each project. And they take that a certain number of credits off of the top and put it into a buffer pool. And that's an insurance pool. So whatever forests end up being reversed by an unintentional reversal, something that was out of the control of the forest owner, they can then access the credits from the buffer pool. The problems with the buffer pool is the risks don't take into account climate change. So the percentage that's being taken off of the top is not large enough for many of these programs. Another problem is that the programs are over-crediting by a lot. So a lot of the credits sort of never represented real emissions reductions anyway. But yes, there's that buffer pool. And I think that there's some thinking going on right now about how we can, for places where we need to do thinning, how you can rewrite the protocols in order to create the greater incentive for thinning and not to create a disincentive for that forest management. And then in terms of forest management, to manage for wildfires, what you want to do is to really take carbon out of the forest, where what we're seeing is that the forests in the west of the US are much denser, like many times more dense than they were sort of before fire suppression. We used to have much more open forests with fewer but much bigger trees, and now we have much denser forests with more smaller trees, and that causes risk of wildfire because you just have a lot of biomass close to the ground that can sort of spread to the cover. So what you want to do is thin and sort of make our forests look more like past forests, take out a lot of the smaller trees and ladder fuels the branches and sort of allow the forests to grow into bigger, older trees. Does that answer the question?
I believe so, yes. Then I wanted to ask you about any thoughts on what effect the new SEC, for folks not in the US, Securities and Exchange Commission, carbon disclosure requirements, what effect those might have on the quality of carbon offsets?
Thanks. Yeah, I think a lot of us are really excited about this new disclosure policy that might be coming out. And my apologies for talking so much about the US context, but these sorts of disclosure rules can be implemented elsewhere as well. So the Security and Exchange Commission, which regulates the financial industry in the US, came out with a rule proposing, it's a draft rule, so we can comment on it if anyone's interested, but it proposes a set of disclosure requirements that would require companies to disclose the amount to disclose several things, to disclose what their climate risks are, how their businesses can be, what the risks climate change poses to their businesses, as well as their actions to mitigate those risks and to reduce their own emissions. Where reducing their own emissions, it would be disclosing what their plans are, including extracting out how much they'd be reducing their own emissions directly and how much they'd be procuring credits from outside of their supply chain. And then for those, there's also a proposal to require disclosure of what offset credits they're procuring. And I think I think that just shining or creating transparency can do a lot to support quality, and that it makes it really clear what companies are doing, like those companies that are really directly reducing their own emissions versus those that are just buying offsets. And it also allows us to understand what offsets they're buying, so that there's more pressure to really do due diligence and not have the risk of buying credits that are found to be poor quality.
Thank you. Okay, it's always hard when I have to decide between all these excellent questions. But
I'm happy to stay on longer if people want. Yeah.
Okay, great. I have one though that caught my eye, and because it's of interest to me too, and I think it might be for a lot of folks. Just your insight into why the particular types of projects that California uses are the ones that they are, and why other ones like agricultural practices, regenerative agriculture from like no-till, that sort of stuff is not included.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. It's hard to pass a protocol or even a protocol change through the California government. It goes through a long process of developing and public consultation. It's a lot of effort. And I think that California decided really carefully what protocols they were going to accept as offsets. And I think specifically with agriculture, there's a huge potential for reducing emissions from agriculture and increasing sequestration in soils. It's also really tricky. There are a lot of uncertainty, a lot of variation from plot to plot, even within a single farmer's land. There could be, different regions can have different emissions from soil and emissions of N2O from fertilizer. And yeah, it's just really complicated. So I think there's a lot of scrutiny into California's system. And I think that they choose really carefully what protocols to put forward. And while people are still here, let me just say I'm happy to answer questions via email. I'm also happy to stay on longer.
As much as I would love to just expand into additional Q&A, we do try and keep it at the hour. And so I will encourage folks to reach out to Barbara, since she so graciously offered that. And I did see somebody asked if you would mind sharing the slides,
Sure.
which I think you had said you would be willing to do. So if you would email those to me, that would be great. But thank you so much. This was really a nice round presentation of the offset landscape. So thank you, everyone. I'll stop the recording there.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.